The storm hit fast. One moment, the skies were clear, the water calm, and the boat glided smoothly through the Hudson River. The next, dark clouds rolled in, and the wind howled as if it was being controlled by something darker than nature. The boat swayed wildly, as if a vengeful hand had gripped the small vessel, pushing it into the mouth of a swirling abyss. Screams were drowned by the roar of the wind and the splintering sound of wood as the boat crashed against the jagged rocks of an island. "Bannerman's Castle," one of the boaters muttered, recognizing the silhouette of the decaying fortress looming in the distance as the rain lashed their faces. The island was remote, known only for the ruins of Bannerman's Castle, an abandoned military outpost that had stood silently, a monument to betrayal and madness. It wasn't exactly a tourist spot, but the group of friends, 4 in total, had decided to go on an adventurous trip, eager to explore the secrets of this forgotten relic. Now as the storm threw them ashore, there was no choice but to seek refuge within the crumbling walls of the castle. "You're sure this place is safe?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "No other option," Jack, the leader of the group, answered. He was the one who had convinced everyone to take this trip, promising it would be an adventure. Now, with the storm raging outside and no way to contact anyone, he was starting to feel the weight of his poor decisions. The castle looked more menacing up close, its stone walls eroded by time and weather. Its windows were darkened, like empty eyes staring out at the wild river. No one had lived here for decades, but the stories surrounding it had persisted. Stories of betrayal, madness, and death. Some said the castle was haunted. Others claimed it was cursed. With no other shelter in sight, they entered through the rusted gates, the hinges groaning like the whispers of 1,000 lost souls. As they stepped inside, the cold seemed to deepen, like the very walls were exhaling a frozen breath, an unnatural chill that seeped into their bones. "Let's find somewhere warm," Jack said, but even his voice lacked conviction. The vast halls of the castle were dark, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. They wandered through the halls, the sound of their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. It wasn't long before they found themselves in what appeared to be the old armory, the walls lined with remnants of weapons long since rotted away. The castle's walls creaked and groaned as the storm outside picked up intensity, sending gusts of wind through broken windows. But it wasn't the wind that made them uneasy. It was the sound of footsteps. They all froze, their breaths catching in their throats. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, came from the far end of the room. Jack took a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They're just out of sight." Something moved. "Is someone here?" Emily asked in a whisper, though no one had answered her. The group gathered closer, their fear rising. Then from the darkness came the unmistakable sound of marching boots. Thud, 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 like soldiers in formation. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound, and in the distance faint, flickering lights appeared, illuminating a shadowy figure in military garb. "Guys, am I seeing this?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure marched in place, as if following some phantom command, its back straight, the motion stiff and mechanical. A chill ran down their spines as they realized it wasn't a living person at all. The figure's eyes were hollow, and its form seemed to shimmer, like smoke coalescing into a solid shape. It passed through them without a word, its presence heavy with a sense of something ancient and unforgiving. "I think we should leave," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. But before they could move, a loud bang rang through the air, as if a gun had been fired. Yet there was no one around to fire it. The sound reverberated through the stone walls, shaking the ground beneath them. The group exchanged frantic glances, fear clawing at their hearts, and then they saw it, the reenactment. The castle came to life, its walls shifting, warping as the shadows of soldiers began to take shape. They moved in slow motion, as though the past had bled into the present. Spectral soldiers lined up against the stone walls, their faces twisted in agony, their hands bound, their eyes wide with fear. The air grew thick, oppressive, and then the sound of shouting filled the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The echoes of battle from another time seemed to surround them. "Please, let's go now," Emily cried, her voice high with panic. But the castle didn't want them to leave. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shift, the stone moving like liquid. The group stumbled, their watches flickering. Jack checked his phone, but instead of seeing the storm warnings they had expected, there were videos they hadn't taken. The screen showed them running through the castle's dark corridors, looking terrified as shadowy figures chased them. What is this?" Jack gasped. Before anyone could respond, the room around them began to distort further. The walls stretched, and the figures of the soldiers came closer. In the chaos, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. As they fought against the door, desperate to escape, one of the shadows stepped forward. It was a soldier, but his face was human, and his eyes burned with rage. "You shouldn't have come here," the soldier's voice rasped, his breath cold and filled with malice. "This place, it claims the souls of those who trespass. The castle has tasted blood, and it will not stop until it has more." One by one, the shadows closed in around them. The ground trembled, and the spectral soldiers raised their weapons, preparing for the final strike. "Please," Emily screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the storm, now howling inside the walls of the castle itself. Jack grabbed his phone again, but the screen went black. The sound of marching boots grew louder, and a voice, faint, almost a whisper, called from the darkness. "Midnight? The watch stops at midnight." In that moment, time itself seemed to freeze. And then, nothing. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving nothing but an eerie calm. When the rescue team arrived, they found the boat, abandoned on the shore. But the castle was silent, as it always had been. No sign of the group, no trace of their struggle, nothing but the faint echo of marching soldiers. The island had claimed its new souls. They told me not to go. The old men at the cafe, their faces wrinkled like dried figs, had leaned in close when they overheard me mention Krakow. Their voices dropped low, almost trembling. "Krakow is dead," one said. "It's better you let it stay that way. Things there, they remember," muttered another, eyes darting toward the hills beyond. But curiosity is a kind of hunger, and mine had already started eating me alive. The sun was a white-hot coin in the sky as I drove up the winding dirt road toward the abandoned village. Krakow clung to a rocky cliffside, its skeletal remains silhouetted against the harsh Italian afternoon. Stone houses slumped into ruin. The tower of a long-abandoned church jutted up like a broken tooth. It was perfect. I parked near the outskirts, the engine's dying rattle swallowed by a heavy, unnatural silence. Even the cicadas had stopped singing. Shouldering my backpack, I stepped into the village. The streets were narrow and crooked, flanked by crumbling walls. Dust coated everything. There was a strange tension in the air, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Somewhere deep inside, I knew I shouldn't linger, but I wanted pictures, proof. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun dipped behind the hills, and shadows slithered out of every crack and crevice. I should have left when the first mist began rolling in, a thin gray veil that seemed to crawl across the cobblestones like living smoke. But I stayed. When the church bells began to toll, I nearly dropped my camera. I stared up at the tower. The bells swung wildly, their iron tongues screaming into the foggy twilight, but there was no wind, no one in the belfry. The air turned colder. That's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the mist, their shapes flickering at the edges of sight. Men, women, children, clothed in tattered garments from another time. They lined the streets, standing utterly still, watching me with hollow, glimmering eyes. I backed away, heart pounding. My shoulder brushed against a stone wall, and the wall bled. Thick dark rivulets oozed from the cracks, spelling out words in ancient spidery Latin. Rede debitum, pay the debt. A sharp crack split the air. The ground trembled underfoot. Somewhere far off I heard stone shattering, doors slamming, heavy footsteps. The ghosts began to close in, their mouths stitched shut by black cords of shadow. I turned and ran. But no matter which way I went, every alleyway twisted back to the same open square. A crumbling piazza dominated by the ruins of an ancient well and a blackened gallows. I was trapped. The fog thickened. Shapes solidified. A tribunal had gathered at the square's center. 12 ghostly figures seated on broken chairs, their faces hidden by cracked Venetian masks. At the head stood a man in a crimson robe, holding a battered leather tome. He pointed a skeletal finger at me. The trial had begun. A guttural voice echoed from all around, not through ears, but through bone and mind. You come bearing no offering, you come bearing no penance, you come to mock the sacred debt. How do you plead? I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. My feet refused to move, rooted to the cursed stones. The crimson-robed figure opened the book. Blood dripped from its pages, hissing as it hit the ground. The tribunal's heads turned toward me, one by one, as if pulled by invisible strings. "Guilty!" the voice hissed. The well began to bubble. Black, viscous liquid rose from its depths, oozing over the cobblestones like a living thing. Shapes writhed within it, grasping hands, screaming faces, things that should not have been. I stumbled backward, slipping on the slimy stones. Suddenly a question ripped through my mind, slicing through the terror. If you were in my place, what would you do? Fight the ancient curse, or bargain with it? Answer in the comments below. Seamless transition. In my case, panic chose for me. I bolted toward one of the empty alleyways, praying I could find another way out, but the paths shifted. Walls leaned closer. Doors melted into featureless stone. The entire village was alive, rearranging itself to herd me back to the square. The mist thickened into choking ropes, wrapping around my wrists and ankles. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog, dragged back to the center. The tribunal stood as one. The robed man raised a rusted dagger high. The figures behind him chanted in broken Latin, Rede debitum, rede debitum, pay the debt. Before the blade could fall, something changed. A faint glow flickered from the outskirts of the square. A figure appeared. Not a ghost, but a woman, flesh and blood. She wore a worn traveler's jacket and hiking boots, her face grim and scarred. "Get up!" she barked. She hurled a handful of powder into the mist. Where it landed, the ghostly villagers shrieked and recoiled, their forms flickering like broken projection. "Move, before they bind you forever." Somehow, my legs obeyed. I scrambled to her side. She thrust a small amulet into my hand, a crude carving of an eye, rough and ancient. "Focus on the road you came from. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." We sprinted through the village as the bells screamed louder, as walls bled rivers of ink and blood, as unseen things howled my name. Behind me I heard footsteps, running, stumbling, sobbing, voices crying for help, voices that sounded like my family, my friends. But I didn't look. Step after step, the mist thinned. The stones beneath my feet grew firmer, more real. And then, like passing through a curtain, we broke free. The air was clear. The night sky glittered with cold, distant stars. Krakow loomed behind us, dark and still once more. I collapsed onto the dirt, gasping. The woman knelt beside me, her face unreadable. "You're lucky," she said. "Most don't make it out." The village always hungers for more. Who are you? I croaked. She smiled grimly. Someone who made the mistake you almost made. Years ago, without another word, she vanished into the darkness, leaving only the amulet behind. I never found her again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the bells of Krakow tolling in the distance, calling me back to the trial that never truly ended. And deep down, I know. One day, I might have to answer the summons, for real. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The small boat rocked gently in the dark waters, casting fleeting shadows across the jagged cliffs of Hashima Island. Beneath a dull orange sky, the former coal mining powerhouse stood as a silent witness to the decaying passage of time. Now it was a place of rumors, whispers, and mysteries, long abandoned but never truly forgotten. David, the leader of the documentary crew, stood at the bow of the boat, his eyes narrowed, watching as the island grew larger in the distance. "This is it," he said, his voice thick with excitement. "We're about to uncover something the world doesn't know about, something the government has kept hidden for decades." Beside him, his team, a group of 3 eager young filmmakers, buzzed with anticipation. Emma, the sound technician, adjusted her camera as she glanced at the island. "I've read so many stories about this place. Ghosts, hauntings, but nothing concrete. This is going to be huge." Tom, the camera operator, leaned over the side of the boat, his fingers clutching his camera. "If it's anything like the stories, I can't wait to get started." He grinned, but there was an edge of nervousness to his voice. The boat creaked under the strain of the waves as they neared the shore. The fisherman's gruff voice broke the silence. "Don't say I didn't warn you. This island's got a curse on it. People don't come back the same, or sometimes they don't come back at all." David smiled. "Don't worry, old man. We're just here for the footage. It's all for the documentary." The fisherman snorted but didn't reply, instead cutting the engine as the boat reached the narrow, rocky beach. The group disembarked, the cold bite of the wind greeting them immediately. Hashima Island stood before them, an eerie, decaying monument to human industry and neglect. The remnants of concrete buildings jutted out like the skeletal remains of a long-dead giant. As the boat pulled away, disappearing into the foggy distance, Emma turned to David. "You sure this is a good idea? It feels wrong." David gave her a reassuring smile. "We've got the gear, we've got the time, and we've got each other. We'll be fine." But deep down, even David couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about this place wasn't right. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The wind howled as they made their way into the heart of the island. The crumbling buildings loomed over them, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. Rusted iron doors, broken windows, and collapsed walls seemed to swallow the daylight. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a mixture of mold, salt, and something else, something faintly metallic. "Let's start in the main building," David suggested, pulling out a map of the island. "The administration office, we can get some solid footage there." The team followed him as they entered the first building. Their footsteps echoed eerily in the empty corridors, the silence only broken by the occasional creaking of metal and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. Emma adjusted her camera, capturing the derelict environment. The walls were stained with grime, and the remnants of old machinery littered the floors. As they moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder, the chill sinking into their bones. Yet there was something else, too. A pressure in the air, something suffocating, almost as if the very island was watching them. They continued exploring, each room more desolate than the last. In one they found a small office with an old dusty desk. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age. In another they found a break room, the tables still set with old rusted cutlery. It looked as though the workers had just stepped away, leaving everything behind. "We're not alone," Emma whispered suddenly. David turned to her, brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the far corner of the room. "There. Did you hear it? It sounds like pickaxes, like workers hitting stone." The sound was faint, like a distant thud, but it was unmistakable. The rhythmic clanging of metal striking rock echoed from deep within the island. Tom's eyes widened. "There's no one here. Are we really hearing this?" David hesitated, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He checked his camera. "Let's go check it out. We need to capture everything, no matter how strange it gets." Chapter 3. The Unseen Presence. As they ventured deeper into the island's underground tunnels, the noise grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the sound of pickaxes anymore. Now there were murmurs, soft whispers that seemed to call to them from the darkness. It was as though the island itself was alive, breathing with a history that refused to die. "Do you feel that?" Tom asked, his voice trembling slightly. "The air, it's different down here." David nodded. "It's like the walls are closing in on us." The tunnels were narrow and winding, the concrete walls slick with moisture. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. And then they stumbled upon something that sent a chill through their bones. A small room, untouched, as if frozen in time. There were beds, neatly made, still covered with faded blankets. Tables were set, with mismatched plates and chipped cups, as if the workers had just left for their break and would be back any moment. Emma stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. This isn't right. Why is everything still like this?" David snapped his fingers, trying to shake off the unease. "We need footage. Let's keep going." But as they turned to leave, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the room. They froze. The footsteps weren't their own. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with terror. David's heart pounded in his chest. It's probably just the wind, or an echo, but deep down, he knew. The footsteps were closer now, too close to be ignored. They rushed to the entrance of the room, but as they stepped into the hallway, the sounds grew louder, closer. Each step was deliberate, heavy, as if something or someone was following them. "Run!" David gasped. They sprinted through the tunnels, their breaths ragged as they tried to escape. But every time they turned a corner, the footsteps were right behind them. Relentless, the walls seemed to close in, the darkness consuming them, swallowing their screams. Chapter 4. The Horror Unveiled. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, they found themselves at the edge of the island, the wind whipping around them. The boat was nowhere in sight. Tom turned to David, panic in his eyes. "What's happening? Where's the boat? We were supposed to be leaving." David looked around, his mind racing. "We've been down there for hours. The fishermen should have picked us up by now." But as the shadows of night crept over the island, they realized the truth. They were trapped. Their only choice was to return to the main building and try to figure out what was happening. But the island had other plans. Back in the main building, they set up their cameras and began to review the footage. David watched in disbelief as the screen flickered. At first it was nothing, just shaky shots of the crew exploring the island. But then the figures began to appear. At first, they were shadows, faint outlines that flickered in the corners of the frame. But as the footage played, they grew more distinct. Tall, gaunt figures that followed them through the corridors. They moved faster than the crew did, always just a step behind, but never seen by the naked eye. "What the hell?" Tom breathed, watching the figures grow closer with every blink. Emma's hand trembled as she pointed to the screen. They're getting closer." David stared at the screen, his heart racing. "We need to get out of here, now!" But the shadows were already closing in. Chapter 5. The Final Moment. As they tried to escape, the shadows grew bolder, more solid. They weren't just following anymore. They were hunting. The building seemed to shift, the walls warping and closing in on them. The whispers became louder, more frantic, filling their heads with unbearable dread. The footsteps were everywhere, echoing all around them, and the shadows moved in the corners of their vision. And then, as the last of their hope faded, they heard it, soft at first, but unmistakable. The sound of pickaxes hitting stone. This time, it was inside the room with them. The shadows surged forward, engulfing them in darkness. And then, just like the workers before them, they were gone. The camera footage, still recording, showed the empty halls of Hashima Island. The shadows, however, remained, waiting for the next group to dare step onto its cursed soil. There's a thrill in the forbidden, in the places where others dare not go. For most, the Chernobyl disaster is a distant, painful memory, one that faded with time and the distance of history. But for some, it's the ultimate challenge, an opportunity to step into the heart of a ghost town, to seek out something others can't even fathom. Jake was one of those people. He had spent his teenage years dreaming of adventures far beyond the norm, climbing mountains, diving into shipwrecks, and exploring long-forgotten cities. But none of these compared to the forbidden allure of Pripyat. The whispers of the lost town had plagued his thoughts for years. He wanted to be the one to document it, to get the footage no one else dared to capture. A true adrenaline junkie, driven by the idea of viral fame. Think of the views, he muttered to himself as he adjusted his camera. His Geiger counter beeped sporadically, but Jake, ever confident in his ability to outwit danger, dismissed it with a grin. The rusted gate to the Pripyat amusement park loomed in front of him, as if welcoming him to its decayed embrace. The once bright signs had faded to dull, ghostly remnants of a bygone era, an era where children laughed and parents watched with joy as their kids rode the Ferris wheel. Jake entered through the broken gates, the eerie quiet of the park sinking into his skin. Every step echoed through the hollow expanse of the once vibrant playground, and as his camera rolled, he took in the details: cracked pavement, rusted rides, and graffiti-covered walls, symbols of abandonment. Yet the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of history, tinged with something darker, something unnatural. As he ventured deeper into the park, the fog rolled in, thick, suffocating. It crept in like an unwelcome guest, its tendrils curling around his feet, rising to his ankles. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the air, but Jake shrugged it off. Just the wind, he thought. But there was no wind. Not a single breath of air stirred the mist, which seemed to move of its own accord, like it had a mind of its own. He stopped at the rusted Ferris wheel, the heart of the amusement park. Its once bright colors were now muted under years of corrosion. He could almost see the children laughing and pointing from their seats as it creaked and groaned, struggling to turn under the weight of time. Perfect, Jake whispered to the camera. This is it, the iconic shot. But as he focused on the Ferris wheel, the atmosphere around him seemed to shift. The distant sounds of children's laughter pierced the silence, soft at first, then growing louder and more distinct, high-pitched, childish, and so innocent. But there was a coldness to the laughter that sent a shiver crawling up his spine. Jake's thumb hovered over the camera's record button, but before he could press it, the carousel, the rusted, broken carousel, began to spin. A chill ran through Jake's veins as the carousel moved. No wind, no breeze. It turned slowly, the creaky sound of its old machinery filling the air. The painted horses, faded and cracked, seemed to move of their own accord, their eyes gleaming in the dull light as if they were waiting for something or someone. But it was the laughter that unsettled Jake the most. It wasn't coming from the speakers of the carousel. There was no power to the park, no speakers, no electricity, yet it filled the air, growing louder, closer. He backed up, his heart pounding in his chest. His camera shook slightly in his hands as he scanned the area around him, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was then that he saw them. Shadows darted between the corroded bumper cars, moving so quickly that they seemed to flicker like the reflection in a broken mirror. His breath caught in his throat as he zoomed in with his camera. There, a figure, small, hunched, a child. A pale, distorted reflection of a child stood near the bumper cars, staring directly at Jake with eyes that shimmered unnaturally in the dim light. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly turned his gaze away. But the sight of those eyes lingered. It was as if they had burned into his retina, leaving a mark that wouldn't fade. The laughter grew louder now, echoing in every direction. It wasn't just one child anymore. It was a chorus of voices, of tiny ghostly children laughing in unison, their eerie giggles bouncing off the broken walls of the amusement park. It felt like they were coming from everywhere, surrounding him, trapping him in their ghostly world. "Get it together, Jake," he muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. He checked his Geiger counter once more. The needles spiked. The radiation levels were rising rapidly. Jake could feel his head growing foggy, the dizziness beginning to settle in, but he dismissed it. He had come too far to turn back now. It wasn't just the air that was thickening. It was the ground beneath him. He felt as if the earth itself was pulsing, as though something was stirring beneath the layers of decay. The carousel stopped spinning, but the laughter didn't cease. It became more erratic, more insistent, as if the children were calling to him. "Please," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just a few more shots, and then I'll leave." But as he lifted his camera to capture another shot, the lens caught something moving in the broken mirror of the carousel. The reflection wasn't his. It was the reflection of a child, a pale, transparent face, smiling. It had the same glowing eyes Jake had seen in the shadow by the bumper cars. Jake's heart raced as he stumbled backward, but his foot caught on something soft. He turned to look and saw a set of small, dirty shoes sticking out from beneath the carousel, as if a child had been playing there and had never left. The temperature dropped. A cold, unnatural chill swept over him, the fog growing thicker, suffocating. The sounds of the children's laughter turned to cries, sharp, painful, desperate screams that echoed through the fog. The mirrors shattered. The glass splintered across the ground, sending 1,000 jagged reflections of broken children into the air. Jake turned to run. He could hear the patter of tiny feet, the whispers growing louder in the fog. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, his Geiger counter shrieking in warning. But he couldn't stop. He needed to get out. But when he reached the exit, the gate didn't open. It was as if the park itself had locked him in. The fog thickened around him until he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. The laughter of the children grew deafening, swirling in a chorus of voices he could no longer distinguish from his own screaming thoughts. And then, as he turned around one last time, he saw them, the glowing-eyed children, their ghostly forms swirled in the fog, their tiny hands reaching toward him, their smiles wide and unnatural. "Come play with us, Jake," they whispered in unison, their voices now a chilling sing-song chant. And as the radiation sickness began to take hold, the last thing Jake saw before the world went black were their glowing eyes, forever young, forever trapped. Jake was never seen again. His camera, found weeks later, had footage of the park, the fog, and the eerie laughter that still lingers in the radioactive air of Pripyat. The silent screams of the lost children echoed in his final moments, forever trapped in a place where time stood still, where the echoes of the past refused to be forgotten. And now, the park waits for the next thrill seeker, for the next one to come too close, to ignore the warnings, and to hear the silent screams of those who never escaped, forever young, forever trapped. In the heart of Germany's dense forests, long forgotten by the modern world, stood Belitz Heilstätten, a crumbling relic from a time of war and disease. Once a thriving sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, it had since fallen into ruin, a place whispered about in local legends. The sprawling, decaying buildings of Belitz had become a sanctuary for the supernatural, and among the many ghost stories, one stood out: the tale of the forgotten children. The rumors told of young patients who had come to the hospital seeking treatment, only to have their lives swallowed by disease, war, and neglect. No one had ever seen them leave. The local people spoke in hushed tones about the small, ghostly figures that wandered the hallways, their eyes hollow with sadness, their small hands reaching out as if to say goodbye. But none of that mattered to Elijah Markham. Elijah was a seasoned ghost hunter, well known for his daring investigations and relentless pursuit of proof of the afterlife. For years, he had traversed haunted locations across Europe, capturing evidence of spirits, ghosts, and other worldly phenomena. His latest obsession was Belitz Heilstätten, a place that had intrigued him for years. The forgotten children, he thought. This could be his breakthrough. Equipped with cameras, EVP recorders, and an array of gadgets designed to detect the paranormal, Elijah entered the gates of Belitz one cold autumn morning. The hospital's skeletal frame loomed ahead, a monument to despair and decay. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots as he walked. He had read all the stories, listened to the warnings. The children's spirits were said to be drawn to the living, especially those who sought to uncover their secrets. But Elijah wasn't afraid. His belief in the afterlife had always been unwavering, and he was determined to capture the truth. The pediatric wing was his destination, the very heart of the children's suffering. As Elijah stepped inside, the air grew damp and heavy. The rooms were abandoned, but the smell of old medicines and antiseptic still clung to the walls. The floors were covered with mold, the windows darkened with grime. But what really struck him was the silence. It was an oppressive kind of silence, the kind that gnaws at your bones. Elijah set up his equipment in the hallway, a long corridor lined with rooms that looked like they had been frozen in time. Dust covered every surface, and forgotten toys lay scattered across the floor. A once colorful teddy bear, now dark and moldy, a wooden train car, chipped and broken. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and began his investigation. As he moved through the rooms, he felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped, and a chill ran down his spine. He turned on his EVP recorder, asking aloud if any spirits were present, if the children still lingered in the hospital. The silence responded. Then in the far corner of the room, Elijah noticed something strange, a faint sound, like a lullaby, drifting through the air. His heart skipped a beat. No one had been here for decades, yet the soft hum of a child's song seemed to echo around him, as if the walls themselves were singing. He stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold air. As he neared the source of the lullaby, he froze. On the dusty window pane before him, there were handprints, small, childlike handprints, forming one by one as though someone was reaching out from the other side. The prints were not smudges or marks from the wind. They were distinct, clear, and fresh. A sudden urge to leave washed over him, but he ignored it, focused on his mission. He turned his camera to the window, filming the handprints. But as he looked through the lens, something caught his eye. A figure, small and childlike, appeared in the corner of the room, dressed in a faded hospital gown. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow, deep pits of sorrow staring back at him. Elijah's heart raced. He had seen ghosts before, but this was different. The child wasn't just a fleeting apparition. It was real, solid, almost tangible. And then there was another, and another. Figures began to materialize in the corners of the room, their expressions mournful, pleading. They stared at Elijah with eyes that seemed to call out for help, but no sound came, only the hum of the lullaby. His breath hitched, and his hands shook as he turned to leave the room. But when he tried, the hallway seemed different. The walls had shifted. The corridor now stretched endlessly before him. He turned back to the room, but the door was gone. It had vanished. The hallway behind him was a blur, distorted, stretching farther and farther into nothingness. Panic rose in his chest. "Hello?" Elijah's voice cracked. "Is anyone there?" The sound of tiny footsteps echoed from the dark hallway, soft, quick, and far too many to be human. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The figures of children began to move, appearing in every doorway, their hollow eyes following him as he backed away. Suddenly a cold hand brushed his shoulder. Elijah spun around, but no one was there. The temperature plummeted. His breath came out in jagged gasps, visible in the air. Then the whispers began. At first, it was barely audible, but soon it grew louder, a chorus of tiny voices, soft and insistent. The children, their voices rising in desperation, whispered his name. "Stay. Play. Stay with us." A cold, shrill laugh cut through the air, and the walls began to pulse. The hospital seemed to warp and twist, the ceilings and floors bending as if the very building were alive. The corridor stretched on forever, a maze of decaying hallways that led nowhere. Elijah was trapped, no exit in sight, and then it hit him. The children weren't just lost. They were angry. Their loneliness had festered, turning into a bitter rage. They wanted him to stay and play with them forever. The walls closed in, the corridors narrowing, pushing him further into the hospital's heart. His footsteps were no longer his own. They echoed with the sound of tiny feet. Elijah turned in circles, his mind racing. He knew it was too late. There was no way out. The building had swallowed him whole. With one last scream, he disappeared into the shadows, never to be heard from again. The next morning, the authorities found his abandoned equipment, the cameras still running, capturing nothing but silence. The forgotten children of Belitz had found their next playmate, and now they waited for the next curious soul to wander in.